Well, this all began for me when my American editor, Clive Priddle, rang me up with some really remarkable news because he'd been helping his wife's parents clear out their attic in New York, and they got a skip and they were going to just chuck everything, and he saw this signature in amongst the rubbish, Wallis Simpson. And, he started to have a look, and there were loads of letters from Wallis Simpson, letters when she was on honeymoon, letters just before her ill-fated trip to Nazi Germany before the war. And there were also letters from the Duke of Kent, George VI's youngest brother, in amongst this cache of letters. And it turned out that a distant relative on his wife's side had been best friends with the royal family in the 1930s and 1940s. And that's how we ended up with these amazing letters. So that's what started the trail.
So you got fantastic access to new material. So what did you find out?
Well, so Clive, my American editor, and I got talking and about the royal brothers during the Second World War. And the more we looked at the king and his brothers, 3 brothers, there were a huge number of conspiracy theories. They were up to all sorts of nonsense. One was liaising with Goebbels, and one was trying to set up secret peace missions, and, you name it, they'd done it. And we started to think, well, hang on a minute, what's the truth? What would these letters tell us? What would other primary sources tell us? And what were those royal brothers up to during the war?
Yes, tell me about the brothers, because I get very confused that there was a king who was George, but he wasn't George really, and there's another brother called George.
I know. Not only do they all have lots of names, but they change their names. And, George comes in an awful lot. But you've basically got George VI, otherwise known to us as Bertie, immortalised in the King's Speech. Then you've got the oldest brother, who was Edward VIII, but became the Duke of Windsor, married Wallis Simpson. And then you've got 2 younger brothers who are less well known. First, the Duke of Gloucester, who was known, he was known for his drinking exploits and not the brightest, but now here he is, elevated to very senior position after the abdication as the person who was going to stand in for Bertie if anything should happen to him until Princess Elizabeth came of age. So, suddenly raised to great responsibility. And then you've got the youngest, who has this incredible reputation as an astonishingly flamboyant playboy. If you imagine, being incredibly good looking, which he was, and intelligent and royal, before the war, at a time when the press was very sort of gentlemanly about the royal family. If you imagine anything you could do, you could, and he did. Everything was possible. So, he had a passion for sex, and it was both sexes. There seems to have been blackmail allegations involved. Drugs at one stage was mentioned, and the Duke of, his oldest brother helped reform him. Very, very colourful life. And amazingly, in this cache in the attic, there were letters from his Playboy years, so we could really get a sense of this flamboyant life.
So the youngest brother was wild, but he was harmless, wasn't he?
Wild, but, well, of course, in the conspiracy theories, all sorts was claimed that he was on secret peace missions during the war, and that his plane, he died young in 1942, in tragic circumstances. And there are books written about how he came to die in these tragic circumstances.
So can you shed any light on any of that? Anything new,
yes,
anything definitive?
The Royal Archives were incredibly helpful. And they gave me, I would regard, definitive evidence that showed exactly what happened, that it really put together with the new letters that came through my American editor. We were able to show that the Playboy was a transformed character during the war. And in contrast to the many claims made that said that he was on various peace missions and trying to bring back his brother and all sorts of stuff, it looks as though he was really doing his utmost and rather well. He turned out to be a fantastic diplomat, an ambassador for the British cause in America before the Americans joined the war.
What about the oldest brother, Edward? Because it's been rumoured for a long time that he and Wallis Simpson were traitors, that they supported Hitler and that they were leaking information.
No, I don't think the evidence confirms that he was a traitor. Most of the claims that he is a traitor come from the German telegrams found after the war, where a large number of what would be traitorous claims are made about Windsor, that he was prepared to act as king in the event that Britain is brought to the negotiating table after heavy bombing. But none of this is Windsor's own letters, Windsor's own hand. It's all second-hand reports. But what I did find was, as a documentary maker, I was so keen to find the actual records of what the King and Churchill knew at the time. And we got amazing intelligence documents that allowed us to piece together in 1940 just what they did know, and that in itself was worrying enough, and clear evidence of betrayal, which the King himself had to come to terms with, you know, from his own brother.
So what do you mean by that then, by betrayal?
By betrayal, the fact that he was, well, what we were able to show, first of all, that he was making statements pro-peace at a time when the country, you know, this was not the official position of the country. Everyone was preparing, you know, every man and boy was putting everything into defending England. The fact that he was negotiating for his own advancement at a time when, you know, the British Army was at Dunkirk and he was negotiating for HRHs and recognition and jobs. You know, it's not what you would expect. And, you know, he was putting Wallis's interests before the country. There's very clear evidence that he was talking to known fascists at this most sensitive time. He was liaising with the Germans over their possessions, and, you know, the detail of that is all there in the intelligence documents. And then, of course, we found the evidence that even the host in the house where he was staying, British intelligence concluded that he was laundering money for the Germans, German loot from conquered countries, and liaising with the Germans. And this was the host where he was staying, who was having intimate conversations with Windsor, all reported back to Ribbentrop. So it doesn't look very good.
And the interesting thing from your book is you can tell just how worried they were about him at the time.
Absolutely.
Because the Germans thought they were onto a good thing. They thought,
yes,
put him back in power and he would oversee fascism in Britain when they won the war.
Yes.
And
they couldn't understand what had happened to all the people who had campaigned for peace and appeasement for so long, and they just thought, a change at the helm, reinstate Windsor, Britain will be prepared. They've seen what's happened. You know, we've seen the Blitzkrieg come closer and closer from Poland. You know, now it's at the very gates of England, at the Channel. But I was able, and here this is new, to track the intelligence documents which showed exactly what the King and Churchill knew at the time of his alleged betrayal. You know, intelligence documents where, you know, first of all, British intelligence is saying that Wallis desires at any price to be queen and has been negotiating with the Germans. And then documents showing the detail of their negotiation with the Germans over their possessions, because they had property in France.
George VI comes out of it very well, doesn't he? He was quite intimidated by Churchill, though.
Yes. I thought the relationship with Winston Churchill was really, you know, one of the delights to plot. Because when Winston Churchill takes over, and of course the country is on its knees, France is falling, desperate telegrams coming in all the time. It couldn't have been a worse catastrophe. And George VI is finding it hard to trust his new Prime Minister. You know, he can scarcely believe he's made the appointment. And, you know, this is a man who even his friends call a pirate and a gangster. You know, he's had this warmongering stance. Is he the right man to lead the country? And at first, George VI was really unsure.
And he sounds intimidated.
I'm sure he was intimidated. And, you know, Churchill didn't have time for the king. You know, the crisis was upon him. He was absolutely engulfed in the catastrophe, and he was almost rude and offhand in those early weeks when he took over. So it gets off to a very bad start, but it is so fascinating, and this is plotted in his diary, you know, how close they become, how much they come, each man, to really see each other's worth. And that's quite moving to see. So in the end, I see it that George VI and Churchill were almost like brothers. And the real brothers weren't on speaking terms. So it's quite moving to see that transformation.